On the 6th of June 1918, across these now peaceful fields in northern France, a legend was born. On that day, thousands of servicemen of the US Marine Corps would fix bayonets and charge into the teeth of a German defensive line bristling with machine guns. For many, it was a one-way trip, but for all, it was a charge into the history books. In this video, using the latest technology, veteran testimony and hitherto unseen perspectives of the battlefield, we'll explore the story of the Devil Dogs at Belleau Wood. But how exactly did those Marines find themselves in this location at that time? To answer that question, we need to zoom out and back a little to March of 1918. It was at that time that the German army, after 4 years of brutal warfare on the Western Front against the French, British and their respective empires, were in deep trouble. With ever-dwindling resources and the United States officially entering the conflict but not yet arriving in huge numbers, a decisive battle was needed to end the war. Enter the Kaiserschlacht, or Spring Offensive. Actually a series of offensives. They were designed to split the French and British apart and destroy them piecemeal before the inevitable American tide would make victory impossible. Those first shots heralding the start of the Spring Offensive came in a fog-shrouded morning on the 21st of March 1918. Under an enormous bombardment, elite new stormtrooper units broke through the Allied lines, driving them back tens of miles across the old Somme battlefields. Attack after attack rocked the Allies in the coming weeks, but although that defensive line certainly bent, it just would not break. Increasingly desperate throughout April and May, one more assault would be launched northeast of Paris, Operation Blücher York. Designed to draw away the last French reserves from the hard-pressed British and force a negotiated peace. It very nearly succeeded. Under intense pressure along this area of the front, the French made a fighting withdrawal over a number of days of more than 35 miles in constant close contact and bloody combat. But this time they weren't alone. Finally, after months of recruiting, training, equipping and shipping at breakneck speed, the first American units were ready to enter the fight. That key contribution were coming stemming and pushing back the German tide right here, around Belleau Wood. So who were those men, affectionately known as doughboys? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, they were a motley mix of men from all over the US and the world, reflecting the broad demographic of American society at the time. In this part of the line was in fact the men of the 2nd Infantry Division, known as the Indian Head Division, who were to take up the fight. The main fighting component of a division consisted of 2 infantry brigades, each of around 8,000 men. With the 2nd Division with the 3rd Brigade consisting of the 9th and 23rd Infantry Regiments and the 4th Marine Brigade consisting of the 5th and 6th Marine Regiments. All 4 would see action in the fight to come. For the Marines, it would be the biggest battle in their history and one which would give rise to a number of Marine Corps legends. Amongst their ranks were some incredible characters. Let's meet a few. First was this man, First Sergeant Daniel Daly. Born way back in 1873 in Glen Cove, New York, and of Irish descent, he was an impressive 45 years old when he arrived in the vicinity of Belleau Wood, and already a legend in the Marines. Holding no less than 2 Medals of Honor, one of only 38 men in history to achieve that feat, he had earned his first medal in the Battle of Peking during the Boxer Rebellion and the second in the 1950 Haiti campaign. Respected and admired by all under him, the 2nd Division's commander, Major General Lejeune, would simply state of the short but powerfully built Daly, he was the outstanding Marine of all time. By June 1918, Dan Daly was First Sergeant of the 73rd Company, 6th Marine Regiment. Fighting in their sister regiment, the 5th, was Captain Lloyd Williams, a 31-year-old Virginia native who joined the Marine Corps in 1909. He too, unusually amongst US servicemen at the time, had seen combat, this time in Nicaragua during the little-known Banana Wars. By June 1918, Williams was commanding 51st Company, 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines. Finally, there was this man, James Guthrie Harbord. Born in Bloomington, Illinois way back in 1866, he had joined the army as a private soldier in 1889, rising through the ranks before being commissioned in 1891. Since then, he'd seen service in Cuba and the Philippines, and later in the Pancho Villa expedition, where he'd become a close friend and confidant of then Brigadier General Black Jack Pershing. A highly regarded major in 1917, Pershing had chosen Harbord to accompany him to France. By May 1918, the 52-year-old was a brigadier general commanding the 4th Marine Brigade. But what about the area they were to occupy? Let's understand it a little better. As we recall, the line in this area had been pushed back close to 40 miles in the final days of May 1918, creating the Marne salient, meaning that by the time the doughboys of the 2nd Division arrived, the front lines ran through this stretch of ground, from approximately the village of Veuilly through Bussière, Torcy, Belleau, Brèche, and eventually to Vaux, close to the River Marne. For the Germans, the objective here was a simple but often misunderstood one. For many years it's been said that the fight at Belleau would stop the Germans from reaching Paris, and whilst it is true that the German 4th Reserve Corps here were as close to the French capital as at any other time in the war, they weren't actually trying to reach it. The assault mounted to a diversion, an attack to draw Allied reserves away from the French. So when the 2nd Division did eventually take to the field on the 1st of June, it would arrive right here, in reserve, around the village of Lucy-le-Bocage. It was here the following day that a famous incident takes place in which Captain Williams of the 51st Company was said to have encountered a French major who suggested his men retreat as the French were doing, to which he uttered the iconic reply, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." A powerful statement for sure, but accurate? Probably not. Multiple records in fact tell us that the French withdrawal was a planned retrograde movement, with hard-pressed poilus due to pass through the 2nd Division ahead of the main German advance, with the 2nd Div then to take the lead in the line. And the panicking French major had actually suggested that William reposition his line towards the enemy rather than withdraw. But it's a catchy phrase at an important moment, and the media liked it too, so it stuck. That said, there was no shortage of hard fighting for the doughboys, and over the coming days, Marines and soldiers alike would demonstrate their mettle at great cost. So with that repositioning, by the 3rd of June the Allied line looked like this. On the left, the French 43rd Division held the area around Veuilly. To their right, south of Bussière, was the French 167th Division, and on their right flank the Americans had entered the line, holding from south of Hill 142 to Vaux. Finally, on their right once more were the French 10th Colonial Division. Despite some small skirmishes over the next 48 hours, no further German assaults were incoming, and by the 5th of June that final offensive had been, as planned, halted by the German High Command, and the lines began to be reinforced. That change in posture effectively meant that from now on it would be the Allies who would do the attacking. The actual plan for the advance to recapture the salient that had formed would begin here, not with the Americans but rather with the French 167th Division. It was their assault towards Bussière that would be the main effort, to be supported by the doughboys of the 2nd Division who would advance on their right. It was only a single sentence in the American divisional orders which actually mentioned the capture of Belleau, with the following: "as soon as possible after the execution of the first French operation." Unsurprisingly, given the 2nd Division's high morale and desire to get into the fight, General Omar Bundy decided that all on the same day he could support the French assault and take Belleau Wood. His plan was like this. Early on the 6th of June, 2 battalions of Marines would advance alongside the French and capture the high point of Hill 142. Once that was secured, one of those 2 battalions would detach and hit Belleau Wood from the flank, at the same time that 2 further Marine battalions would assault the enemy position frontally. There were, though, several problems. 1. No reconnaissance was done prior to the attack. 2. No artillery preparation was agreed, and so men would be advancing without protective fire. And 3. The men were to attack in waves, something which all the major powers on the Western Front had long since abandoned in favour of more advanced infiltration tactics. Sadly, and despite incredible bravery, the scene was set for disaster on that first day. That said, some success was seen early on. Despite using outdated tactics and struggling to maintain command and control in their first major battle, the Marine assault on Hill 142 was successful and the strong point was taken, with a loss of some 325 men, opening the door for the far sterner test to follow. Let's move in closer to their objective. Here we see the distinctly shaped Belleau Wood, which sits on higher ground than the surrounding area. The real problem here, though, was twofold. Firstly, the approaches to the wood across a series of wide open wheat fields from both the south and west offered absolutely no cover for the attacker. And secondly, because no reconnaissance had been performed, the attackers had literally no idea what they might be facing. All that changed at 5 PM when the 3rd Battalion 5th Marines advanced from this very location in open order against the silent tree line of the woods some 500 yards away. In just moments, the leading waves of the battalion were met by a withering fire as the distant objective burst to life with the crackle of automatic fire. Perhaps as many as a dozen machine guns hammered into the attackers with their fire converging from multiple angles. For the Germans, who had not seen such a crude frontal assault for some time, there was a mix of bewilderment and admiration. It was clear that the unit in front of them was inexperienced, but it was obvious too that their determination and courage was of the highest order. Tragically for the Marines, that courage came at a huge cost, and within minutes across this very field, hundreds of men lay dead or dying. To the right of that carnage, 1st Sergeant Dan Daly and the men of the 3rd Battalion 6th Marines began their own advance. Again in waves, they pushed on towards the southwestern edge of Belleau Wood under a withering fire, but despite the losses, incredibly they pressed on. It was here in this very location that 1st Sergeant Daly was credited with uttering the famous words, "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" Powerful as this phrase is, and has become over the intervening century, it's actually not quite correct. Daly himself later recalled that he actually said, "For Christ's sake, men, come on, do you want to live forever?" Whatever the truth, the inspirational leadership of men like Dan Daly drove the survivors of the 6th Marines forward to eventually gain a small but vital toehold in the thick undergrowth on the southwestern edge of Belleau Wood. It had come at extraordinarily high cost though. By the end of that first day, the Marine Brigade had suffered in excess of 1,000 casualties. For context, that's more losses than the USMC had suffered up to that date in all of its wars combined. Lieutenant Cook, 55th Company USMC, was amongst those to reach the edge of the wood. He recalled the brutal close-range fight that ensued. The shadows moved to surround us. Without the slightest warning, those shadows were suddenly split apart by chattering, stabbing flames. A crackling sheath of machine gun bullets encased our battalion. Down, down, take cover. Some were already down to stay. Many hurled themselves into the nearest shell hole, but a few of those kids stubbornly pushed forward until their legs were shot out from under them. As the first handful of bullets whipped past my head, I hit the deck and rolled into the nearest crater. Peeking over the edge, I saw one of my men stretched close to earth in a furrow of ground. I crawled forward and shook his leg. The man was dead. To one side lay another, doubled up, both arms locked rigidly about his shattered middle. Off to the left, a gun rattled and bullets searched the air a few inches above my cowering body. When it ceased, I lifted my head and saw a third man, Lieutenant Cummings of the 51st, crawling towards me, painfully dragging his right leg. "Where's your outfit?" I asked. "The machine guns got 'em. As far as I know, I'm the only one left out of 10 officers and 250 men." Back at headquarters, Brigadier General Harbord now found that the very real Achilles heel of command on the Western Front reared its head: communications. With such devastating losses to his leading units, it was unclear what had actually happened. Conflicting reports of disaster and complete success arrived at different times. It seems Harbord himself, optimistically, had chosen, in fact, to credit the reports which suggested that the Marines had captured the entirety of Belleau Wood, when in reality they perhaps held just this small portion. As a result, Harbord sent word to Division, who sent word to Pershing that Belleau Wood had been taken. It was not all failure though on that day. To the right of the 6th Marine sector, some troops had advanced and successfully forced the Germans to withdraw from the village of Buresh, which by nightfall had been occupied by a thin screen of perhaps a few dozen Marines. To their right, in another sadly confusing affair, 2 battalions of the Army's 23rd Infantry had also advanced, though not ordered to, against a position known as Hill 192. Checked by heavy machine gun fire, they were counterattacked at nightfall, and it was only with the help of the 9th Infantry and French support that they managed to withdraw and avoid complete disaster. There's no doubt that the first day of the attack on Belleau Wood had been an eye-opener. Incredible courage, and it was seen many times that day, was simply not enough to dislodge an experienced and well-entrenched enemy. It was a lesson learned the hard way by both the French and the British in the years before. Now the doughboys had learned it too. Over the next few days, only skirmishing would take place around the wood as those in the southwest corner clung on against heavy enemy fire. It was, though, the story on either flank that was the main event. On the left, the French 167th Division, the main attack force, continued their slow and methodical advance, capturing Veuilly and towards Bussière, badly mauling the highly experienced German 5th Guards Division in the process. On the right too, the 10th Colonials made progress onto the lower slopes of Hill 204. It was these advances that meant that the attacks could recommence on the Bois de Belleau. On the 11th, the Marines once again attacked, with their objective being here, halfway into the wood. This time they would do so with artillery support. Again, the assault was in waves, and the 5th Marines suffered terribly advancing across the open ground from the south, but this time we start to see a change. Small units, squads and groups of men would adapt and improvise of their own accord, using the terrain for cover to begin to make progress into the wood. As the fight descended into almost point-blank firefights in the badly shattered wood and undergrowth, the Marines pushed on, eventually linking up with other units and for the first time gaining a real hold in Belleau. Desperate to force the Americans from their newly won ground, the Germans launched a counterattack which drove the Marines back to the southern portion of the wood. But undeterred, the Marines fought back and, despite heavy losses in a hellish environment, had regained their positions by the end of the day. The end of that day's fighting prompted General Harbord to once again send a communique to headquarters to the effect that all of Belleau Wood had been taken. Again, he was incorrect, as the Marines in the wood knew very well. By now, utterly exhausted, they were, in Harbord's own words, about all in. Nevertheless, the fight would go on. Throughout the 12th, the fight in the central and northern portion continued, now punctuated by the horrors of more than 6,000 gas shells which dropped into the wood and drenched those on both sides, meaning that men now had to fight at point-blank range with cumbersome gas masks, further restricting vision. Amongst the casualties was Captain Lloyd Williams, who, gassed and wounded by shrapnel, reportedly told approaching medics, "Don't bother with me, take care of my men." He was killed a short time later whilst being evacuated. By the following day, almost the entire remnants of the 4th Marine Brigade was engaged within Belleau Wood itself. Heavy fighting by exhausted men made the firefight a nightmare for all involved. Despite extraordinary bravery, the Marines, though, were simply too exhausted to go on, and by the 15th of June, General Bundy, commanding the 2nd Division, was forced to ask for relief. That same day, the 7th Regiment of the US 3rd Division relieved the battered survivors in Belleau Wood. Over the next 3 days, those soldiers would also push on, but with none of the hard experiences of the Marines, their attacks looked much like those on June the 6th, the result being little gained for much lost. With the army now fighting for its life in Belleau Wood, the Marines could finally draw a breath and reorganize behind the lines. It should be said at this point that Belleau itself had become something of an obsession for General Harbord, who was determined to take the wood at all costs, despite it originally only being a supporting objective for the main French attacks on either flank. That said, for those in the wood, it was far from a sideshow. By 23rd of June, the Marines were once again back in the line, with the objective to capture the last machine gun in Belleau Wood. This time, the Marines showed that the awful losses they had suffered were not in vain. Over the previous 2 weeks of brutal fighting, they had learned a huge amount. It's fitting in a way that the final act of that fight was one which saw artillery and now experienced infantry working together as they meticulously advanced to drive the exhausted German defenders from the northern tip of Belleau Wood and withstand one final counterattack. By the 25th of June 1918, General Harbord could once again, but this time truthfully, state that all of Belleau Wood was in the hands of the Marine Corps. The fight in this area was of course still far from over, but at last Belleau Wood was taken and would remain in Allied hands for the remainder of the war. The cost though had been enormous. The 2nd Division alone, in the fighting around Belleau and the town of Vaux, which was to follow, had cost upwards of 10,000 casualties, thousands of whom today lie in this stunning cemetery on the wood's northern edge. Of those who did survive the fight, they would never forget this place. Men like Dan Daly, that legendary fighter who was recommended to become the first man in history to receive a third Medal of Honor. Sadly, it was not forthcoming, but he did receive both the Navy Cross and the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, making him one of the most decorated Americans in history. So what did the fight at Belleau Wood really mean? Strategically, in the greater scheme of the war on the Western Front, in truth, not much. It was not a vital piece of ground that would change the outcome of the war, and it didn't, as is often said, halt the German march on Paris. But what it did do, and remarkably well, is demonstrate the determination and resourcefulness of American troops, show how they could and would stand and fight, and that from that time until the end of the Great War, the doughboys of the AEF would give their all. That brings us to the end of this video. If you found it interesting and would like to know more about the story of the American Expeditionary Force in the First World War, why not check out our video right here on YouTube following the fascinating story of the famous Lost Battalion. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.